Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we are going to continue our coverage of the ongoing crisis between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. I was going to also do an overview, or am going to do an overview of the Ukrainian armed forces and just what kind of resistance we could expect from the Ukrainian military if and when the Russian armed forces were to launch an invasion of eastern Ukraine or quite possibly the entirety of the Ukraine. But first, let's look at some of the news headlines about what is happening inside of the Ukraine. So first, Newsweek, Ukraine says worst scenario is Russia invades next month. The Kremlin denies plans to attack. Mail Online, Biden says he's putting together plans to deter Putin from invading Ukraine. I bet he is. Let's see here. What else do we have? IntelliNews, blunting the javelin. The prospects for NATO participation in a Ukraine-Russia war. Reuters, Biden says putting together comprehensive plan in Russia-Ukraine crisis. The Hill, Biden says his team is working on initiatives to prevent Russia invasion of Ukraine. Putin, Kremlin TASS. Putin tells Erdogan Kiev seeks to stall Minsk agreements. And it really goes just on and on. Sputnik, U.S. reportedly plans Javelin missile delivery to Ukraine. Reneges on surface-to-air missiles. Interesting. Okay. Well, that's a good segue into the discussion about the Ukrainian armed forces. So first, if we look at Ukraine, at least in terms of the eastern portions of the country, they are at a significant disadvantage in terms of the terrain. So eastern Ukraine is very flat. It is ideal for tank warfare and motorized warfare. And if we look at the annals of history, there is Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history that took place in this area between the forces of Germany and the Soviet Union. And again, this is the terrain that extends into eastern Ukraine, vast plains, not a lot of foliage in some areas, fields of sunflowers at times, but again, it is very good terrain for large motorized, mechanized operations, the like of which we would see from the Russian Federation as it advances into Ukraine. So again, Ukraine is a very large country. You can measure it yourself, very, very significant in size and scope. The population is just over 40 million people. Probably close to 17 to 20% of that is Russian, and many of the Ukrainians are actual supporters of the Russian Federation and many speak Russian as their first language. So there's a definite divide between the east of the country, with many of them being supporters of possible unification or being part of Russia, and then obviously in the west we see quite a bit of nationalism and pro Ukraine. Pro-Ukraine persons who just are vehemently opposed to any form of possible unification with Russia, and sees Russia, for all intents and purposes, as a mortal adversary. And again, that goes back many years, from the reign of Stalin and some of the horrific atrocities that he did to the Ukraine. And I'm not going to get into that, but again, just really the focus on the Ukrainian military. The ground forces of the Ukraine field roughly 160 to 170,000 personnel. They have an additional air mobile and special operation command, which is another 8,000 or so additional personnel. The crucial issue with the Ukraine is really will it fight? And the Ukraine forces that exist now are much different than those that existed in 2014. Obviously, much has changed. There has been many training operations with NATO, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, a host of nations have gone to the Ukraine and assisted the Ukrainians in helping train its military. And in fact, some of the lessons that the Ukrainians have learned fighting the Russians in eastern Ukraine have actually benefited NATO as well. So it's just not all one side teaching the Ukrainians how to fight, but in fact some very beneficial information about some of the operational processes by the Russian Federation, by the Eastern Separatists, has in fact helped NATO as well. They have an immense industrial capacity throughout the nation. They were able to build tanks during the Soviet era. There was immense Soviet era manufacturing capability in the Ukraine, both in eastern Ukraine, and since there's also been development of the arms industry in western Ukraine as well, specifically near Kharkiv. A lot of factories exist in Kharkiv and other places again in the east. They were producing the T-64 main battle tank back in Soviet times. The Ukrainian military now uses the T-64 very widely. It is not the same T-64 in a lot of cases of Soviet times. It has been modernized significantly. Again, the Ukrainians probably possess around 1,000 operational main battle tanks, if not more, if they marshal their reserves. They continue to upgrade their tank and armored fighting vehicle industry. They're producing really everything they need. Both in terms of main battle tanks and armored vehicles. They have produced some fairly decent quality armored fighting vehicles with thermal imaging optics that have been adopted by other nations as well. They also have a National Guard, which consists of about 50,000 personnel. Let me backtrack real quick. Also, that 170,000 man ground forces, much of it is contract, volunteer, professional forces. They still do conscription, but most of their combat arms units are not made up of conscripts. They're professional contract personnel. But again, if you look back in 2014, where the Ukrainians barely had the capacity to marshal around 6,000 troops to possibly go against the Russian invasion of Crimea and in the east, that has changed significantly. So again, the Ukrainian military that exists now is much different than in 2014. And you also have the issue with the United States, as I just mentioned in the news headlines, have given the Ukrainians, sold the Ukrainians the Javelin fire and forget anti-tank guided weapon system, a very good weapon system that has the ability to act as both a weapon system and a reconnaissance system, being able to magnify with a forward-looking infrared optic on it as well. But again, it's really the will to fight right now is the question. If and when the Russians invade the Ukraine, that ultimately is the question. And right now, it would seem by all indications that we have, they are willing to fight, and they probably will fight. Now, how good is their battlefield commanders? Um, how long will that resistance last in the face of a massive Russian onslaught? Again, very hard to say. But again, they also have a National Guard, about 50,000 personnel that can augment the ground forces. Again, they have the special operations and air mobile forces, which, just like the Russians, utilize as a separate branch of the armed forces. Again, it's considered an elite force. At the same time, it's a heavily mechanized force as well, and they both have air assault capacity, and then obviously a mechanized motorized capacity where they directly support the ground forces. And again, that's the air mobile forces of the Ukraine. The Air Force, not obviously, it's under equipped. With Soviet era Su-27s and Su-25 Frogfoots and some Su-24s. Again, that capacity can be measured in dozens of aircraft, whereas the Russians have hundreds of aircraft. So we don't anticipate the Ukrainian Air Force staying in the air very long against a concentrated Russian attack. Now, with that being said, they do have the capability of deploying significant amounts of surface-to-air missiles, in which they would utilize those that could cause the Russians some issue in maintaining aircraft over the Ukraine. And we saw that take place in Georgia with a much less robust air defense network than that of what the Ukrainians currently possess. The Ukrainian Navy is really non-existent and would not play a very large part in this conflict. They have some naval infantry units, but again, very small component of the total armed forces. Once all these forces mobilize within the first weeks of a Russian invasion, we're probably looking at close to 250,000 personnel very quickly, filling out the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces, and then quite possibly mustering to well over 500,000 personnel as the conflict continues. And we naturally would anticipate that there would be a fairly hefty mobilization of reserve forces. And that is one reason that I do not anticipate we would see the Russians attempt to move west of the Dnieper River. I would anticipate that the Russians, if it is a truly massive operation, they would look to take all areas east of the Dnieper River. And again, that would give the Russians a fairly significant strategic barrier to the west. And it would give Russia the confidence that it could create a defensive barrier along the Dnieper River that would probably prevent a NATO response or a NATO move into eastern Ukraine. But again, that is the Russian perception. I do not believe there would be any NATO move into eastern Ukraine or the Ukraine for that matter. It may occur, but again, the idea that NATO could fight and win a war in the Ukraine is really just stupidity talking. If Russia were to truly mobilize and truly look to seize control of Ukraine, there's not much NATO could do about it. There's just not. Again, you're too close to the Russian center of power, and given history, and if you look back upon World War II, if Russia were to completely 100% mobilize, the idea of retaining NATO or even the Baltic republics, as I've talked about before, is just ludicrous. But again, that is the force construct of the Ukrainians. Again, they operate with maneuver brigades, much like the Russian Federation does, with the exception of some of the divisions that the Russian Federation operates. Again, 170,000 personnel, 50,000 in their National Guard, 8,000 plus in their special operations and mobile forces, about 1,000 main battle tanks, another 1,000 plus armored personnel carriers and armored fighting vehicles, plenty of artillery, plenty of self-propelled artillery, towed artillery. They are able to produce much of this. They are also able to produce anti-tank guided weapon systems and even tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. So again, not an easy task if Russia invades the Ukraine. Again, a much more robust and substantial force in terms of manpower than even what the Germans and the United Kingdom currently fields. But again, they've let their military atrophy fairly significantly. But that is the report on the Ukrainian forces. Again, I would anticipate that a large conflict may not occur. But again, given the situation and given the size of the troop movements, it's very hard to actually rule that out. But again, if this conflict were to happen and does occur, it will be a very large, very intense conflict that Europe has really not seen since World War II. But again, we're going to continue to monitor the situation and, of course, report. Have a good day, everybody.